My name isn't important, but what is important is that this is my story, and for the first time in years, I'm going to tell it from my perspective, without watering it down for the sake of keeping the peace. I'm a woman in my early 30s, single, financially stable, and for the longest time, I thought my life was, well, relatively simple. But simple doesn't mean easy, and as I've learned the hard way, family can turn your entire world upside down faster than any stranger ever could. This all started with a house. Not just any house, my house. A place that carried history, memories, and more sentimental value than anyone in my family seemed to want to acknowledge. It wasn't just walls and a roof to me. It was a piece of my grandparents, the only people who ever made me feel unconditionally loved and safe when I was younger. I inherited the house after they passed away. My grandparents weren't wealthy people by any stretch, but they were proud. They had worked tirelessly to buy that house, to make it a home, and eventually to pass it on to me. I can still remember the smell of my grandmother's kitchen, freshly baked bread and her special lavender soap, and the sound of my grandfather humming while fixing something in the garage. Every corner of that place carried their presence. When it became mine, I poured my heart into it. I renovated, repaired, and personalized everything. The kitchen counters that I had dreamed about while flipping through magazines were finally mine. I painted the walls colors that reflected me, not just the dull beige they had been for decades. I planted flowers in the garden, the kind my grandmother used to love, and every time they bloomed, I felt her with me. So, yes, the house wasn't just property. It wasn't just real estate. It was my home, my sanctuary. And then came Mark. Mark is my older brother. Well, technically, growing up, we were never particularly close. He was always the golden child, the one my parents seemed to pour all their attention into. He got praised for the smallest achievements while my successes were brushed off as expected. I learned early on that in our family, Mark could do no wrong, while I was supposed to quietly handle my own life and not rock the boat. He married Jessica about 5 years ago. She was always complicated. On the surface, she played the role of the sweet, doting wife, but behind closed doors, she had this sharp edge, this ability to manipulate conversations in her favor. I never trusted her, though I tried to be civil for the sake of family harmony. Mark and Jessica recently had a baby, a sweet little girl. And while I wanted to be happy for them, things started to shift almost immediately after the baby was born. Suddenly, every family conversation turned into a comparison between my selfish, single lifestyle and their struggles as new parents. At first, I ignored the digs. I figured it was stress, maybe even postpartum tension. But I had no idea just how far things would go. It began with subtle comments. Jessica would say things like, "It must be nice not having to worry about bills when you don't have a baby to raise." Or Mark would sigh dramatically and mutter about how expensive diapers and formula were, glancing at me like I was supposed to whip out my wallet. I kept brushing it off until one evening, Mark decided to make it official. We were sitting in my living room in my house, when he casually announced, "We've been thinking it makes more sense if you give us the house." I laughed. I genuinely thought he was joking. But when I looked at his face, there was no smile. Jessica sat beside him, nodding, her eyes sparkling with this quiet triumph, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "What?" I asked, my voice caught somewhere between disbelief and amusement. "You don't need this much space," Mark explained as if he were laying out some logical business plan. "You're single, you're financially stable, and honestly, it's kind of selfish to hold on to a house like this when we're crammed into an apartment with a baby. Family helps family, right?" I felt my stomach twist. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This house was left to me by our grandparents," I reminded him slowly. "It's mine. It's not some extra property I'm hoarding. It's my home." Jessica leaned forward, her voice dripping with that fake sweetness I'd come to despise. "But don't you think Grandma and Grandpa would have wanted the baby to grow up here? I mean, it's not like you need it. We're family. Shouldn't you want to share your good fortune?" I could feel the anger bubbling in my chest, but I kept my tone even. "This isn't about fortune. It's about respect. And the answer is no. I'm not giving you my house." That was the moment the lines were drawn. From then on, things escalated quickly. My parents got involved, and to my absolute shock, they sided with Mark. You don't understand, my mother said over the phone one night, her voice filled with disappointment. Your brother has a family now. You're just one person. Why can't you be generous? Why are you being so greedy? Greedy. That word cut deeper than I expected. Here I was, living in the house that had been given to me legally and rightfully, and suddenly I was being painted as the villain. Jessica took it a step further, of course. She started posting vague comments on social media about selfish relatives who don't care about family and how some people value bricks and money over love and blood. Extended family members began messaging me, demanding to know why I wouldn't help my brother out. It felt like I was being ganged up on from every angle, and yet I stood firm. This house was mine, and no amount of guilt-tripping was going to change that. But as I was about to learn, Mark and Jessica weren't just going to let it go. They were about to take things to a level I never could have imagined. If I thought the guilt-tripping and social media slander were bad, I was in for a rude awakening. Refusing to hand over the house wasn't just going to upset my family, it was going to turn them into enemies. It started subtly. My parents stopped calling as often. When they did, the conversations were short, tense, and always circled back to the same demand. Why can't you just do this one thing for your brother? He's struggling. Then it became more aggressive. Jessica would text me long messages about how difficult things were for them, paragraphs filled with dramatics about sleepless nights and medical bills. She'd always end with some variation of, "If you truly loved your niece, you'd help us. Giving us the house is the least you can do." I ignored most of it. I knew giving in once would mean giving up everything. But then, one afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox that changed everything. It was from a lawyer. Apparently, Mark and Jessica had decided that if I wouldn't do the right thing voluntarily, they would force me to. The letter claimed that the house was part of a family estate and therefore subject to division among the siblings. I was shaking with anger as I read it. I had the will. I had the documents that clearly left the house to me and me alone. There was no ambiguity. Still, the fact that they were willing to drag me into court over this made my blood boil. I immediately contacted my own lawyer. After looking at everything, he reassured me, "You're fine. The inheritance is solid. They don't have a case." I wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, but deep down, I knew Mark and Jessica weren't going to back down that easily. And I was right. A few weeks later, my lawyer called me in for a meeting. He had a file in front of him, his expression tight. "They've submitted documents claiming partial ownership of the house," he said. "What?" I nearly shouted. "That's impossible." He slid the papers across the desk. And there it was, official-looking documents, stamped and signed, claiming that Mark was entitled to half of the property. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. I could feel my face getting hot, my chest tight. "These are fake," I hissed. "Yes," my lawyer agreed calmly. "But they're very good fakes. Whoever put this together knew what they were doing. It'll take time to prove it's forged, but don't worry, we'll get there." I couldn't believe it. My own brother, my own family, had crossed a line so far that they were willing to commit fraud just to take what wasn't theirs. The stress began eating at me. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how people who were supposed to love me could betray me so deeply. I started second-guessing myself. Was I really being selfish? Was I really the villain they were painting me as? But then I'd walk through the house. I'd run my fingers over the wooden banister that my grandfather had polished with his own hands. I'd stand in the garden where my grandmother's roses still bloomed. And I'd remember, this is mine. They have no right. The first court hearing was surreal. Mark and Jessica walked in, holding hands, presenting themselves as this poor, struggling couple just trying to do right by their child. Jessica even brought the baby, cradling her in her arms as though to say, "Look at what's at stake here." My parents sat behind them, their faces full of disappointment whenever they looked at me. Not once did they come to my side of the courtroom. I was alone, except for my lawyer. When the forged documents were presented, my lawyer immediately challenged their authenticity. The judge agreed to have them examined. That should have given me some comfort, but all I could feel was rage. This wasn't just a dispute anymore. This was war. And in the middle of all this chaos, something came to light that shattered whatever illusion of family I still held on to. It happened by accident. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years reached out after seeing Jessica's social media posts. At first, I thought it was just another lecture about being selfish, but instead, they said something that stopped me cold. "You know Mark isn't your full brother, right?" I blinked at the phone screen, rereading the message over and over. "Not my full brother? What do you mean?" I typed back. The reply came quickly. "Ask your mom about the affair. Everyone in the family knows." My heart dropped. I didn't want to believe it, but the seed had been planted. That night, I confronted my mother over the phone. At first, she denied it, but when I pressed, her silence said it all. Mark wasn't my full brother. He was the product of an affair my mother had years ago. My father had decided to raise him as his own, to keep the family together, and they had kept it a secret from me. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. And suddenly, Mark's sense of entitlement made a twisted kind of sense. He had always felt like he deserved more, like he had something to prove. And now, armed with this truth, he believed he had a claim not just to my family's love, but to my inheritance as well. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. In fact, he smirked. "Finally figured it out, huh? That house was bought with money that should have gone to my mother and me. You think you're so special because Grandma and Grandpa favored you? You owe me." Owe him? The audacity left me speechless. But if he thought this revelation was going to guilt me into giving up, he was dead wrong. If anything, it lit a fire in me. Because now, this wasn't just about a house. It was about my dignity, my autonomy, my right to stand up and finally say, "I'm done being the scapegoat of this family." The revelation about Mark being only my half-brother shook me to my core. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It wasn't just about forged papers or courtrooms. This was about betrayal on every possible level: family, trust, history. For nights after I learned the truth, I couldn't sleep. I'd lay awake staring at the ceiling, playing old memories in my head on repeat. The times when my parents scolded me for not sharing with Mark. The birthdays where he got the bigger gifts while I got practical ones. The college tuition debates where they said, "Mark just needs more help right now. You'll figure it out on your own." Every single slight, every moment of favoritism suddenly had a new meaning. They weren't just being biased parents, they were compensating, covering for a mistake, trying to make up for the fact that Mark wasn't really my father's son. And in doing so, they had sacrificed me, over and over again. I felt hollow. I wanted to scream at my mother for lying to me my whole life. I wanted to confront my father for choosing silence over honesty. But most of all, I wanted to burn every bridge that tied me to this toxic family tree. And yet I couldn't, because I was in the middle of a lawsuit that demanded I keep my composure. The stress became unbearable. I stopped eating properly. My coworkers noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn. I avoided friends because I didn't know how to explain what was happening. How do you casually tell someone that your brother is suing you for your house using forged documents and, oh, by the way, he's not even your full brother because your mom had an affair decades ago? The isolation weighed heavy. The house, once my sanctuary, started to feel like a battleground. I'd walk through the halls, memories flooding me, but instead of warmth, I felt this gnawing anxiety. What if I lost? What if the court somehow sided with them? My lawyer tried to keep me calm. "They don't have a case," he reminded me. "Fraud is serious. Once we prove these documents are forged, it'll blow back on them." But logic didn't soothe me. Emotionally, I was unraveling. Jessica didn't help. In fact, she turned up the heat. Her social media posts became sharper, more targeted. She stopped being vague and started being obvious. Some people care more about money than their own blood. Some people would rather see their niece homeless than share what isn't even truly theirs. I wanted to sue her for defamation, but my lawyer advised me to hold back. Focus on the case at hand. Don't fight every battle. Meanwhile, my parents grew colder. My mother, in particular, seemed almost hostile, whenever we spoke. "Why can't you just make peace?" she asked during one tense call. "You're tearing this family apart."
Me?
I was tearing the family apart? The hypocrisy stung. "No, Mom," I snapped. "Mark and Jessica are tearing this family apart. They're the ones forging documents. They're the ones dragging us into court. Not me." There was silence on the other end, and then she said, in the most dismissive tone imaginable, "You've always been dramatic." That night, I cried harder than I had in years. But somewhere in the middle of those tears, a new feeling started to form. Anger. Not the kind of anger that makes you lash out impulsively. This was colder, sharper, the kind of anger that plots. Because if my family wanted to see me as the villain, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to be the hero. The second court date approached, and this time, I was ready. My lawyer and I had gathered evidence, comparisons of signatures, expert testimony, proof that the documents they had submitted couldn't possibly be authentic. Piece by piece, their story was beginning to unravel. But here's the thing about liars. They don't stop when they're cornered. They double down. Mark took the stand, and with a straight face, swore under oath that our grandparents had promised him the house would be his one day. He painted me as this cold, selfish sister who hoarded everything for herself. Jessica sniffled in the background, clutching the baby like a prop, her eyes darting toward the judge for sympathy. For a moment, I worried it might work. Theatrics have a way of swaying people. But then my lawyer began dismantling their case, one detail at a time. The forged signatures. The timeline inconsistencies. The fact that their own story contradicted earlier statements they'd made. I watched as the cracks started to show. Jessica's confident mask slipped, and Mark's temper flared under cross-examination. It wasn't over yet, but the tide was turning. Still, the emotional toll was undeniable. I found myself journaling late at night, pouring my rage onto paper. I wrote letters I never intended to send, letters to my parents, to Mark, even to Jessica. Letters filled with everything I'd bottled up for years. "You never protected me. You always made me feel less. You used me until I had nothing left to give." And in those pages, I began to realize something. Revenge wasn't just about winning the case. It wasn't just about keeping the house. It was about reclaiming my voice, my power. For so long, I had played the quiet daughter, the accommodating sister, the one who didn't make waves.
But now?
Now I was done. And as I stared at the stack of evidence against them, a chilling thought crossed my mind. If they wanted war, I was more than ready to fight fire with fire. Because this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about making sure they regretted ever underestimating me. The day after the second hearing, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the evidence spread out across the table. Photocopies of forged documents, witness statements, legal notes. All of it a testament to how far Mark and Jessica were willing to go to steal what wasn't theirs. For weeks, I'd felt like I was on the defensive, barely keeping my head above water. They attacked, I reacted. They lied, I scrambled to disprove it. I was constantly playing catch-up, and the emotional exhaustion was eating me alive. But that morning something clicked. Why was I letting them dictate the battlefield? Why was I letting them set the rules of engagement? If they wanted a war, fine. But I wasn't going to fight it on their terms anymore. I was done being the victim. So I started planning. First, I called my lawyer. "What happens if we prove they forged these documents?"
I asked.
"Well," he said carefully, "if we can prove intentional fraud, they could face serious consequences. We're talking fines, potential jail time, not to mention losing any shred of credibility in the eyes of the court." The idea of Mark and Jessica facing real, tangible punishment sent a thrill through me. For once, it wasn't just about keeping my house. It was about justice, about showing them that actions have consequences. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted public victory. For months, Jessica had been painting me as this heartless villain on social media, dragging my name through the mud while she played the martyr. I wanted everyone, the extended family, the friends, the neighbors, to see the truth. So I started collecting screenshots of Jessica's posts, Messages she sent me where she admitted things that contradicted her public image. Financial records that showed they weren't nearly as destitute as they claimed. Piece by piece, I built a case not just for court, but for the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, at home, I started reclaiming my space. For too long, the house had felt like a battlefield, tainted by their greed. But as I dusted the shelves, repainted a hallway, and planted fresh flowers in the garden, I felt a shift inside me. This wasn't their house. This wasn't their story. This was mine. And I was taking it back. When the next hearing came around, I was different. Stronger. I walked into that courtroom not as the scared, isolated woman they had been trying to break, but as someone who finally understood her own power. My lawyer presented the forensic evidence on the forged documents. Signature analysis, timeline breakdowns, expert testimony. All of it stacked neatly against Mark and Jessica. Their lawyer squirmed, clearly caught off guard by the thoroughness of our preparation. Mark's face turned red as the judge questioned him about the inconsistencies. Jessica, sitting beside him, kept her head down, but I could see the panic in her eyes. And then came the best part. My lawyer submitted Jessica's social media posts into evidence, showing how she had publicly slandered me while simultaneously trying to manipulate the court into seeing me as a villain. The judge's expression tightened as he read the words aloud. It was the first time I saw Mark and Jessica look genuinely cornered. But I wasn't satisfied yet. Because even if the court ruled in my favor, even if they were punished for fraud, I wanted to make sure that everyone, our family, our friends, the entire circle of people they had manipulated, saw them for who they really were. So after the hearing, I made a decision. I sat down at my computer and started typing. I told the whole story. From the moment Mark asked for my house, to the guilt trips, to the lawsuit, to the forged documents, to the family's secret I never asked to uncover. I laid it all out in brutal, honest detail. And then, with a deep breath, I hit post. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't need to. Word spread fast. Within hours, messages started flooding in. Some from extended relatives who had believed Jessica's lies, now apologizing. Some from old friends who couldn't believe the audacity of what Mark had tried to pull. And yes, plenty from people who just wanted the gossip. But the best part? Seeing Jessica's online army of sympathizers scatter like cockroaches under a light. The sympathy posts dried up. The passive-aggressive comments disappeared. Suddenly, the truth was out there, and they couldn't spin it anymore. Mark tried to call me that night. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, his voice tight with fury. You had no right to air our private business like that. You've ruined us. I listened to it twice, then deleted it with a smile. Because for once, I wasn't the one being ruined. I was the one holding the match. And I wasn't done yet. The days following my post felt surreal. For so long, I'd been under the crushing weight of their manipulation, Mark's entitlement, Jessica's constant need to twist the narrative, my parents' blind favoritism. But suddenly the power dynamic had shifted. They were the ones on the defensive now. Jessica's once sympathetic posts had gone silent. Her friends, the ones who used to comment about how heartless I was, vanished. Mark, who once strutted around like the golden sun, was now reduced to angry voicemails and desperate text messages. But I wasn't done. I wanted closure. I wanted justice. And I wanted revenge. So, I pressed charges. The forged documents weren't just a moral offense. They were a legal crime. My lawyer filed a case of fraud against both Mark and Jessica. When the notice was served, I heard later from a neighbor that Mark nearly tore the envelope in half in rage. The idea of my brother, no, my half-brother, having to answer for his lies in a criminal court filled me with a sense of vindication I can't fully describe. For once, there would be accountability. At the same time, I kept reclaiming my narrative publicly. I didn't post every day, but every now and then, I would share quiet, reflective updates. Not angry rants, not personal attacks, just my perspective.
Calm. Clear.
Truthful. And people responded. The tide had turned completely. Relatives who once labeled me greedy were now texting me apologies. Old friends who had kept their distance suddenly wanted to reconnect. Even my parents, those same parents who had sided with Mark without hesitation, called me one evening, their voices unusually soft. "We didn't realize," my mother said. "We didn't know it had gone this far." Her words should have comforted me. Instead, they just made me realize something painful. They did know. Maybe not the full extent, maybe not the forgeries, but they knew Mark had always been favored, always been coddled, always been allowed to take more than he deserved. And they went along with it because it was easier than facing the truth. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just said, "I know," and hung up. Because in that moment, I wasn't fighting for their approval anymore. I was fighting for myself. The criminal case moved slowly, as these things do, but the civil trial regarding the house came to its conclusion faster. And, oh, what a conclusion it was. The judge's ruling was clear and decisive. The house was legally and irrevocably mine. The forged documents were evidence of fraud. Mark and Jessica were ordered to pay my legal fees in full. The look on their faces as the judgment was read was priceless. Mark's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might crack. Jessica's eyes darted wildly, searching for some angle, some way out. But there wasn't one. The gavel came down. Case closed. But the real finale came weeks later, when the fraud charges finally caught up with them. I wasn't in the courtroom that day, but my lawyer called me afterward. "They took a plea deal," he said. "Avoided jail time, but the fines are steep. And their reputation? Shot." I almost laughed. Jessica, the queen of social media spin, reduced to a pariah. Mark, the golden son, now whispered about at family gatherings as the one who tried, and failed, to steal from his own sister. It was better than I'd ever imagined. And the cherry on top? With their finances already stretched thin from having a baby and losing the lawsuit, those fraud fines hit them like a wrecking ball. Word got around that they had to sell their car, move into a smaller apartment, and cut back on everything. Jessica, who once flaunted designer handbags and curated Instagram-perfect family photos, was now pawning off belongings just to make rent. I'd be lying if I said I didn't smile when I heard. Because this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. For months, I had been painted as the villain. For months, I had been gaslit, guilt-tripped, dragged through the mud. And now, the truth was undeniable. The house was mine. My name was cleared. Their lies were exposed. Their greed destroyed them. And me? I was free. Free from their manipulation. Free from their entitlement. Free from the role of family scapegoat I had been forced into my entire life. The house, once again, became my sanctuary. I filled it with warmth, with laughter, with peace. Every corner reminded me not just of my grandparents, but of my own strength. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand in the doorway of the living room, look around at the home I nearly lost, and whisper, "We made it." It wasn't just a house anymore. It was proof. Proof that I could stand up, fight back, and win. And as for Mark and Jessica, they became exactly what they always feared: irrelevant.